Buenas tardes. Tonight's topic is a small one. Gangster capitalism. Is transformation possible? I would say immediately that yes, it's possible but difficult. And I'm going to talk about just a few elements that make up what I think are both the possibilities and the impediments. So I'd like to start by thinking about the way in which there are two necessary elements for transformation, among others. First of all, there has to be recognition that the status quo is in some ways deficient. But I would argue that people are often quite distracted or misled about problems, their causes, and solutions. So that's one of the elements for transformation. A second is the ability to imagine alternatives to the status quo. And I would suggest that these are typically vigorously repressed. And I'll speak about some of the ways in which that occurs this evening. A related concept that I'll spend a little bit of time on is the idea of hegemony, which is governance with the consent of the governed. And for governors, this is a very much preferred form. That is, if the governed believe that the governors are acting in their interests, there's little reason to resist. And so this is an attempt to maintain that kind of governance structure. The alternative form is coercion, which is much less desirable, but becomes necessary when legitimacy of the governance structures are undermined. And we'll think about that just a little bit tonight as well. I'm going to speak just a little bit about the period prior to the neoliberal period and prior to the gangster capitalism period, and just highlight a few things about what occurred in that period, roughly from 1945 to about 1970. So approximately the end of World War II into the end of the 1960s and early 1970s. It's referred to sometimes as regulated capitalism. It's also referred to sometimes as embedded liberalism, sometimes referred to as the golden age of capitalism, and then also sometimes referred to capitalism with a human face. And I particularly like this image because in a minute I'm going to talk about capitalism with the gloves off. Okay, so the period prior to neoliberalism, as I say, approximately 1945 to 1970, is characterized by some very interesting dimensions. In terms of the global economy, the Bretton Woods system, which was established by the United States principally after World War II as a framework for international trade and development, established a number of the major financial institutions that are still with us to this day. The International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs, which was succeeded by the WTO, the Organization for Economic and Cooperative and Development, the International Bank of Settlements, and so forth. There was a fixed currency exchange based on a gold-backed standard, but the US dollar as the world currency. And this is going to become very important as the conversation goes on. Also a moderately open world economy, although with some tariffs and some obstacles to free capital movement. Much more equitable sharing between capital and labor in profits from productivity gains. So if you look at charts from this period, you see a very close association between productivity gains and the gains that workers made. It allowed for U.S. foreign direct investment, including in newly emergent decolonized states, but it also opened the U.S. markets to goods from Europe and Japan, allowed very strong growth in capitalist economies around the world, and it eventually led to a set of problems and a falling rate of profit for capital, and so a new model for capital accumulation was necessary. That new model is the neoliberal period. So approximately 1970 to about 2008. And as you can imagine, these dates are not precise, but are reasonably close. So I want to think a little bit about this neoliberal ideology. The ideas had been around basically since the 1940s, attributed to an organization that's still with us called the Mont Pelerin Society. The principal tenets include things like the liberation of individual, and I highlight individual, entrepreneurial freedoms within an institutional framework characterized by very strong private property rights, free markets, and that's in quotes because the markets are anything but free, free trade, again the same caveat, elimination of the gold standard, but continuation of the US dollar as the global currency, but now I would suggest as a kind of cryptocurrency that is based on nothing but faith, really. And so it's an interesting fact that the US dollar remains the world currency, and we'll think about that a little bit in a minute. The global economy is characterized by the removal of barriers to the movement of goods, services, capital, and money across national boundaries, but importantly, largely keeping labor held strictly in place, so that capital is free to move, but labor is held strictly in place. The role of the state under the neoliberal establishment is to create and preserve an institutional framework appropriate to the practices that I just described, guarantee the quality and integrity of money, set up military, defense, police, and legal structures and functions required to secure property rights and to guarantee, importantly, by force, if necessary, the proper functioning of markets, marketize and privatize all elements of society in areas such as land, water, education, healthcare, social security, environmental pollution. And if markets in these areas don't exist, then they must be created by state action if necessary. And all other actions, basically, of the state are deemed to be illegitimate. So the role of the state is basically to make sure that the neoliberal agenda is fulfilled. The role of the state in the economy, more specifically under the neoliberal regime, is the renunciation of aggregate demand management, which was a hallmark of the previous period. That is, demand management was put in place both to regularize the economy and avoid crisis, but also to more equitably share in the productivity of the economy. So move to supply-side economics, provide subsidies and lower taxes at the top, with the idea that the wealth, of course, will trickle down. Secondly, deregulation of basic industries, deregulation of the financial sector, weakening of regulation of consumer product safety, job safety, and the environment, weakening of antitrust enforcement, which leads to the further development of monopolies and agglomeration, the privatization and contracting out of public goods and services, and finally, cutbacks or elimination of social welfare programs. The period from approximately 2008 to the present and into the reasonably foreseeable future has been characterized by a number of scholars as gangster capitalism. And basically, it's extremely savage, unleashed greed at the top. As you may have heard recently, statistic, 8 billionaires now own the same amount of wealth as the entire bottom half of the planet. So extreme wealth concentration. An assault on all institutions of common good. Citizens have no right to expect help from the state. Dominance of finance capital over all other sectors, leading to crony capitalism. Deepening penetration of privatization in all elements of society, a war on the poor and vulnerable, the massive production of surplus populations, that is, people who are no longer useful to capital as workers and therefore become useless as consumers. Therefore, they are surplus to the capital system. Okay, I'm going to switch gears a little bit and talk about how capital accomplishes these things. And I'm going to use this idea of the spatial fix. If capital is unhindered by investment, that is, if they're unhindered by fixed capital or the need for specialized labor or for specialized markets, they're free to roam the globe and move around the globe in search of cheaper labor, cheaper resources, new markets, or more favorable regulatory and legal environments, called by political scientists arena shopping. You look for the best place to maximize profit through one of these mechanisms or another. That is capital roaming the globe. Right. But tonight I'm going to spend a little bit of time on talking about something that I'm calling the reverse spatial fix. That is, rather than roaming the globe, capital works to bring favorable conditions home. And there are lots of incentives to do this. Rather than have to diversify all over the globe, if you can bring these same conditions to where you operate, this is a tremendous advantage. How do they do this? Well, they cheapen labor where they are by weakening unions, threatening to move, or by automation. They cheapen resources by privatizing the public sphere or changes in technology. They create more favorable regulatory and legal environments. They first consolidate power and thereby change the rules. And tonight, I'm going to talk about one particular mechanism that's a little bit esoteric, a little bit arcane, but is becoming increasingly important in the world of gangster capitalism. These are called governing law clauses in commerce to provide a favorable legal environment. It's another form of arena shopping. But in this case, capitalists are producing these environments directly for themselves. How does this work? We begin with a very simple question that's an important question in international finance. In a multi-jurisdictional case, that is, for example, two sovereign states, which jurisdiction's laws should apply? It's a very fundamental question for international or transnational commerce. Which laws should apply? The choice of law rules, these governing law clauses, are designed to guide this choice. Governing law clauses allow parties in multi-jurisdictional transactions to choose which laws and courts will govern the interpretation and enforcement of their contracts. Okay? Virtually all multi-jurisdictional contracts now include these kind of governing law clauses. Otherwise, the wheels of international commerce would grind to a halt. You have to have some mechanism for interpreting and enforcing contract. They specify the choice of forum, where the case will be decided. They also specify which laws will apply, what kinds of laws will apply to the interpretation of the contract. And these things don't always match. For example, parties can choose New York law but apply English common law, or vice versa. People could go to court in London and use US law. So these don't always match, and people try to mix and match them to their advantage. Historically, most transactions required a reasonable geographic connection between a contract and the courts and laws applied to interpret and enforce it. Okay, I can wander around just a little bit because I can't be confined to the podium. All right, beginning in the 1930s, England recognized the use of these governing law clauses to select English courts and laws for transactions without any connection to English territory. This is a very important change. This gave London predominance in international commerce transactions. In order to compete with London, in 1984, New York State, as the first US state to do this, did away with the reasonable relationship requirement. This allowed transacting parties to select New York courts and laws for governing their contracts, no matter where in the world these took place. At present, London and New York are by far the predominant choices for law and forum and for international commercial transactions. The separation of the location of transactions and the rules governing them means that many people have no say at all in how commercial activity takes place. That is, the laws and the forums are somewhere else. The predominant jurisdictions have control of activities far beyond their borders. Others have little or no control even within their own territories. And this is going to become quite significant in a minute. So how do these GLCs and the reverse spatial fix work? I'm going to give you several examples. The first and most important in a precedent-setting way was a recent historical example, the Argentine debt restructuring. And this, for those of you who don't recognize the person in the front, that's the vulture, and behind him are the hedge funds. But this is Thomas Griesa, who I'll say something about in a minute, the judge who decided this case. In 2001, Argentina defaulted on over $100 billion US in sovereign bonds. This, not coincidentally, allowed the Kirchners to engage in a very significant restructuring of the Argentine economy, much to the favor of the people of Argentina, which is why it became so unacceptable. In 2005 and again in 2010, Argentina restructured deals with over 90% of its creditors, and these became called exchange bondholders. They arranged new rates and new dates for repayment. In 2008, 2009, some creditors refused the deal. That is, they didn't want to go along with this restructuring. NML Capital, who was leading a group of vulture hedge funds, filed suit against Argentina, and importantly, this is how the GLC things work, filed suit in the federal court, the Southern District of New York, okay, not in Argentina at all. Judge Thomas Griesa made several unprecedented, but now precedent-setting rulings that have become extremely important. He ordered, first of all, that Argentina could not pay any of the exchange bondholders, that is, those groups with whom they had made new arrangements, until NML Capital was paid first. So it was a completely arbitrary decision on Griesa's part. He also issued, because international finance does not allow the seizing of sovereign funds in the home country, he couldn't seize Argentina's funds. So what he did was issue a very broad injunction against any party anywhere aiding Argentina in processing payments to anyone but NML Capital. This included all parties involved directly or indirectly in advising upon, preparing, processing, or facilitating any payment on the exchange bonds. The injunction was not limited to parties in the US and also prohibited Argentina from seeking alternative payment routes even outside of the US. So you can begin to see how this set of governing law clauses infringes upon the actions of sovereign nations, even though none of the activities took place in New York. All right. So what does this mean? This raises a number of questions that have extreme salience right now. The first question is, at what point in the sequence of transnational transfers does the money go from belonging to the originating country, in this case Argentina, to belonging to the creditors? There's a whole chain of events when Argentina deposits the money in another bank. But the decisions that Griesa makes raise this question. At what point in that chain does the money no longer belong, in this case, to Argentina? Secondly, at what point do payment processors, these intermediate banks and so forth, go from acting on behalf of the originating country, that is Argentina, to operating on behalf of the creditors? And finally, at what point, if any, does a US court have jurisdiction over payment streams outside US borders? These were all questions raised by this decision that Griesa made. Griesa's rulings eliminated Argentina's control and exerted US control as soon as the money was transferred from Argentine accounts to the first trustee bank, in this case the Bank of New York, Mellon. They also transferred some funds to Bank of New York, Luxembourg, and the same kind of rules applied, even though that stream was completely confined to Europe. Rulings have gone largely unchallenged and have thus greatly extended the jurisdiction of the US, New York, over transnational commercial and financial transactions of all kinds. Postscript, very brief postscript for this case. In 2016, several of the hedge fund holdouts settled with Argentina for over $4 billion. The original default was 80 million. 80 million with an M. They settled for over 4 billion with a B, including 2.4 million for NML Capital on bonds it had purchased for $117 million. So a nice return for 15 years' work. All right. The US has used control of the world financial system since the end of World War II to impose sanctions on adversaries and competitors. The use of these governing law clauses and the NML Capital versus Argentina case has greatly expanded the scope of these instruments. The US is now thinking it is free to act most anywhere in the world. The extension of extraterritorial jurisdiction stemming from Greece's decisions has allowed the US to prohibit virtually any other sovereign nation from circumventing the sanctions that it imposes, mostly through fear of losing access to US markets and to the US-controlled financial system. So these have gone largely unchallenged, but the US has now extended its control. These sanctions regimes, sometimes called soft power, have arguably caused the deaths of more innocent civilians in this time period than overt military operations, through blockages of vital goods and services like food and medicine and so forth. So this is not really soft power. Give you a second example, a little more contemporary. Here is an emergency declaration. Pursuant to the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, blah, 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 I hereby report that I've issued an executive order, the order, declaring a national emergency with respect to the unusual and extraordinary threat to the national security and foreign policy of the United States posed by the situation in Venezuela. The order does not target the people of Venezuela, but rather is aimed at persons involved in or responsible for the erosion of human rights, guarantees, and so forth. So you can see the thing that motivated this emergency declaration by Barack Obama, not the present administration, is clearly concern over the legitimacy of the Maduro government. It's really quite clear that this is not a legitimate government. He was not elected properly. Unlike this. Okay, you get that point. Nevertheless, this is a statement by a US State Department official. The financial sanctions we have placed on the Venezuelan government has forced it to begin becoming in default, both on sovereign and PDVSA, its oil company debt. And what we are seeing, because of the bad choice Maduro regime, not the sanctions that they imposed that he's bragging about here, is a total economic collapse in Venezuela. So our policy is working. They're forcing Maduro into bad choices, clearly. Our strategy is working. We're going to keep it on the Venezuelans. This is reminiscent, of course, of the assault on Allende and making the Chilean economy scream. According to one estimate, Venezuela has lost approximately $350 billion, including opportunity costs, things that money could have been spent on otherwise, between 2013 and 2017, due to US-imposed sanctions and boycotts. And that's the source for that. Quote here, modern-day economic sanctions and blockades are comparable with medieval sieges of towns. 21st century sanctions attempt to bring not just a town, but sovereign countries to their knees. This is from UN Special Rapporteur in Venezuela, Alfred de Zayas, in January of 2019. De Zayas further suggested that the International Criminal Court, who of course the United States does not recognize, could investigate the sanctions and economic warfare being waged against Venezuela as crimes against humanity. Clearly, the purpose of the sanctions regime is twofold, at least. One is to effect regime change in Venezuela, and two, and this gets back to the question of how we thwart alternative imaginaries to transformational change, is to signal similar consequences for others seeking to escape the imperial control and gaze of the United States. This is meant to signal to other countries that you don't want to step too far out of line. Okay, finally, two last examples. Here's a near future example, Cuba. In addition to the nearly 60-year embargo to quash the Cuban Revolution and prevent the spread of an alternative imaginary to capitalism, the use of GLCs and the Griza decision are being used to ratchet up pressure on the current Cuban regime. Title III, very obscure thing actually, Title III of the 1996 Helms-Burton Act, which is otherwise known, without irony, as the Cuban Liberty and Democratic Solidarity Act, allows former owners and their heirs of properties nationalized by Cuba's revolutionary government to bring actions in US courts for compensation for what they lost. Okay? So think about this in the chain that we're thinking about here. Implementation of this law has been delayed every 6 months, sort of routinely, for the past 23 years. That changed in March of this year, this month. That is, the Trump administration has announced they're going to begin to implement this. The effect will be to further investment uncertainty and destabilization of the Cuban economy, which is clearly part of the overtly stated plan of the US to remake Latin America, as the US has remade the Middle East, remake Latin America, and pursue regime change in what John Bolton declared the troika of terrorism, reminiscent of the axis of evil. That is Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Cuba. So this is part of that plan. One last example, which will come a little closer to home, okay? Mexico. I'm going to give you a very brief timeline here of some recent events, very brief. January 4th, 2019, and it's related to the previous example. Mexico refused to sign the Lima Accord demanding Venezuelan President Maduro step down, okay, citing the Mexican Constitution. January 23rd, Guaido declares himself the interim president of Venezuela. Mexico reiterates its position of non-interference, again based on the Mexican Constitution, something rather reasonable. January 25th, Mexico offers, along with Uruguay and the Vatican, to mediate the Venezuelan conflict. January 29th, Mexico, Bolivia, and the Caribbean community, the CARICOM community, refused to demand new elections in Venezuela. Oops. January 29th, same day, interestingly enough, Secretary of State Pompeo cancels a planned trip to Mexico, which presumably was going to be discussing Central American refugees on their way through Mexico to the United States. January 29th, the Wall Street rating agency Fitch downgrades the credit rating of Pemex by 1 full point, from BBB plus to BBB minus. Okay? Immediate effect is much more expensive for Pemex to borrow money and thereby wipe out some of the savings that AMLO was hoping to effectuate rather quickly. Okay? So I'll just leave it to you. Coincidence? Message sent, message received. Okay. All right. So I'm going to now just wrap up by thinking a little bit about some of the effects of neoliberalism and gangster capitalism, and then get to the point where we think about transformation. There's been a general race to the bottom, part of the spatial fix for capitalism. In terms of wealth and income inequality, I already mentioned the Oxfam study of 8 billionaires. Health and welfare impacts, which have been enormous. Environmental effects, including climate change, has been a result of the inability to think past this stage of capitalism. Weakening position of labor everywhere, commercialization and privatization of everything, including indigenous knowledges, practices under intellectual property rules, patents, copyrights, trademarks. economic instability, the Mexico peso crisis of 94, 95, Asian crash, only the most recent, the global financial crisis of 2008. Surplus populations that I've already talked about, and disposable people, the role of finance capital, that is producing profits without producing anything else, a reserve army of labor, which has a disciplining effect on the labor that remains employed. Oops. And finally, a changing base for state legitimacy. States can no longer guarantee the welfare of their populations, so they have moved to a new form of legitimacy, from the welfare state to what some have called the garrison state. Scapegoating of endless enemies, foreign and domestic, from whom the state must protect the worthy citizens. Okay. Marx and Engels in the Communist Manifesto said class struggles must end in either a revolutionary constitution of society at large or the common ruin of the contending classes. Following that, Rosa Luxemburg, based on analysis by Karl Kautsky, his formulation, as things stand today, capitalist civilization cannot continue. We must either move forward to socialism or fall back into barbarism. There have been a rise of social movements in reaction to neoliberalism, globalization, and financialization. So big question is, what will be the state and elite response to these kinds of mobilization? Will it be acceptance and change? And if so, will that be real or artificial? Will it be increased repression? Will it be some combination? On the one hand, the struggles to maintain power in the status quo, often through increasingly coercive measures. So some of the things I've talked about tonight, evolving mechanisms becoming more and more sophisticated for retaining elite control. That is, rather than simply through military operations, control of finance and pressured countries that way. The rise of right-wing nationalism and populism, scapegoating of vulnerable populations. It's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. That is, as we see, no room for alternatives to be allowed. Thwarting the Latin American pink tide, to quote one of your presidents, so far from God, so close to the United States. But, on the other hand, there's constant pushback arising from deteriorating material conditions. All those social movements arise out of somewhere. That is, people recognize that the system is failing them. So youth-led movements of all kinds, whether it's for climate activism, social justice, indigenous movements, the Yellow Vest movement in France, which has been largely misinterpreted, resurgent labor movements and worker takeovers and cooperatives, again, producing new imaginaries and new ways of thinking about how things might be organized. And then finally, after two previous defeats, AMLO was elected, right? So there is some hope, but I don't want you to get too hopeful, and I'll end with one last quote. Men, and when Marx was writing this, it was men, make their own history, but they do not make it just as they please. They do not make it under circumstances chosen by themselves, but under circumstances directly encountered, given, and transmitted from the past. The tradition of all the dead generations weighs like a nightmare on the brain of the living. So AMLO was elected, but it's important not to think of people of any sort as a kind of savior. They operate within a set of contexts that themselves are extremely problematic and must be changed if even good leaders are going to be allowed to engage in transformation.
Well, one of the advantages of being 90 years old is that you get a little bit of leeway to indulge in reminiscences. So if you don't mind, I'll start with a reminiscence, which happens to be pertinent. It's exactly 80 years, almost to the day, since the first article that I wrote under circumstances that are eerily similar to today. The article was written immediately after the fall of Barcelona in February 1939. That was the end of the Spanish Republic, end of the anarchist revolution. That was, in my opinion, the greatest victory for freedom in modern history. The fall of Barcelona was also the occasion for the flood of refugees to Mexico in particular, about 40,000, and also to New York, near where I lived. In New York as a child, I was able to meet many of them in anarchist offices and bookstores in New York City, which I used to visit wherever I could, gaining a serious political education. Well, I don't remember much about the article, and I hope it's disappeared because I'm sure it's embarrassing. But I do remember the first sentence, which is pertinent. The first sentence was Austria falls, Czechoslovakia falls, Toledo falls, and now Barcelona falls. The point was that the spread of fascism at the time seemed inexorable and terrifying. I didn't know at the time, and most people still don't know, but at the time, in 1939, the US government was beginning a series of studies about how to deal with the post-war world. War Peace Studies, they were called, the State Department and the Council on Foreign Relations, which is the leading extra-governmental institution concerned with establishment foreign relations. And what they were assuming at the time, in 1939, was that the war would end. This is before the US was officially in the war. They assumed that the war would end with a German-held world, including Eurasia, and an American-run world, which would be what they called a Grand Area. The Grand Area under US control would include the Western Hemisphere, obviously, the former British Empire, which the United States would take over, and the Far East, including, of course, China. And there would be a split between the non-German world and the German world. And those plans were actually held until essentially 1942. Stalingrad indicated that the Russians were perhaps in a position to beat back the Nazi conquest of the world. A couple months later came the huge tank battle at Kursk, which the Russians won, and it was then, by then, beginning to be clear that the Nazi plague would be defeated by the Russians. And planning changed. I'll come back to how it changed after that, which is very relevant to Latin America. Well, fast forward 80 years until today. We're seeing right now the reversal of what was called the pink tide. It was a period of real progress and hope for a better future for the people of Latin America. It's now being reversed with the rise of repressive and, in some cases, neo-fascist forces. There are two primary exceptions in Latin America, Mexico and Uruguay. And they have, somebody doesn't like that. Mexico and Uruguay have a critical role to play in trying to keep the spirit alive. This died, I think. Is it okay? Okay, let's go on. As very often in the past, the so-called Colossus of the North is exercising its powerful and malign influence, as Marv just discussed, and Canada trails not far behind. Well, it's worth thinking a little bit about the background. So Latin America is a very interesting phenomenon in world affairs. It's a region with enormous wealth of resources, as many other advantages. Nevertheless, it suffers from extreme poverty, radical inequality. In Latin America, typically, privileged elites have essentially no responsibility for their societies. It's very revealing to compare Latin America with East Asia. East Asia, Taiwan, South Korea, they lack the resources of Latin America. They don't have the enormous security of Latin America from abroad, not excluding the North. Taiwan and South Korea in the last 50, 60 years followed a Japanese-style industrial policy program. They imported capital goods, but with targeted investment, had to go to the places they wanted in accord with the overall industrial policy, and also with technology transfer. Capital investment had to be accompanied by handing over control over technology. That actually is the way England developed in the first place, robbing superior technology from India, the Low Countries, even Ireland. And it's the way the United States developed all through its history. And in fact, it's true of every other developed country. Now that's barred. That's called in economic history kicking away the ladder. First you climb up, then you kick away the ladder so that others can't do it. So the World Trade Organization doesn't permit this. We're condemned China for trying to use the methods that we used and so on. That's standard. Well, that's East Asia. Latin America was quite different. It imported luxury goods, not capital goods, as part of an industrial policy. In East Asia, export of capital has been very tightly controlled. There was a time you could even get the death penalty for it in South Korea. In Latin America, nothing like that. Capital flows freely. That provides elites with homes in the Riviera and so on, other luxuries. Taiwan and South Korea have become major industrial powers. It's worth remembering that 60, 50 years ago, South Korea was at about the level of Ghana in Africa. Latin America has never escaped the colonial legacy. Efforts to do so have regularly been crushed with crucial involvement from the United States in one way or another. Well, let's go back to World War II. World War II initiated an enormous change in the structure of world affairs. Prior to the United States had been the richest country in the world for a long time. By the late 19th century, it was richer than all the other industrial powers combined. But it was not a major player in the world. Latin America it was, but not in the world. The major player was England, secondarily France. Well, that was pre-war. By 1939, as I mentioned, the U.S. was already planning to change that situation. And of course, the war ended with an enormous change. The United States displaced England, marginalized France, became the world dominant power with wealth and power of no historical precedent. Had, by some estimates, as much as maybe close to 50% of world wealth, extraordinary security, overwhelming military force, and so on. Well, I mentioned before the War Peace Studies groups. By about 1943, when the success of Russia in defeating Germany was already pretty evident, the plans were changed. They recognized there's not going to be a German-run world. The Grand Area plans were expanded, not just Western Hemisphere, East Asia, the former British Empire, but as much of Eurasia as the United States would be able to take over. Certainly Western Europe, the industrial, commercial heartland of Eurasia. These were the plans towards the end of the war. Well, what about Latin America? In fact, the plans were, after the war ended, the plans were then transferred from planning systems like the War Peace Studies Group to the government. The State Department policy planning staff, led by George Kennan, worked out ways to implement these plans region by region. Each region was assigned its function, as it was called, within the whole system. So the function of Southeast Asia was to provide resources and raw materials to the former colonial powers for their reconstruction within the US-dominated system. Africa, George Kennan said, was not of particular interest to us, so we would hand it over to Europe to be exploited, his word, for its reconstruction. You could imagine a different relation between Europe and Africa in the light of their history, but of course that wasn't considered. Latin America was called our little region over here, which was going to be complementary to the United States. In February 1945, right before the end of the war, the United States called a hemispheric conference in Mexico, where it brought together the powers of the hemisphere, and it imposed what was called an economic charter for the Americas. What the charter declared is that economic nationalism, as it was called, was barred in all of its forms. So what's economic nationalism? The State Department explained, I'll quote, "Economic nationalism is the aspirations of the people of Latin America for policies designed to bring about a broader distribution of wealth and to raise the standard of living of the masses, based on the belief that the first beneficiaries of the development of a country's resources should be the people of that country." That's economic nationalism. The belief is obviously misguided. The first beneficiaries of a country's resources should be US investors, while Latin America performs its service function. Latin America should not have what was called excessive industrial development. So, for example, Brazil could produce steel, but not high-quality steel of the kind that the U.S. could produce, things that the U.S. wasn't interested in general, would be complementary. Incidentally, there was one exception unmentioned to the barrier against economic nationalism. That's the United States. The United States was permitted, of course, nobody permitted it, it just arrogated to itself the right to carry out a very extensive industrial policy. In the post-war period, there's enormous state planning, research, development, funding, which essentially created the high-tech economy of the future. Computers, internet, microelectronics, satellites, mostly public funding under an industrial policy system, which wasn't called that, but it's what it was. The second point is that what was called sound economics is what determines that it's U.S. investors that gain the access to the resources. Sound economics is sometimes called neoliberalism. Neoliberalism, in fact, if you trace it, goes back to right after World War I. It was primarily developed by economists in Austria. People are now famous. Look at von Mises, Friedrich Hayek, and others. It really was imposed extensively only under Reagan and Thatcher. That's the last generation. But its roots go far back. when it was imposed in the 1980s, the current era of neoliberalism, it immediately led to the disasters of structural adjustment in Latin America, the famous lost decades, similarly elsewhere in the South. And it led to the distress that is now evident in the industrial world after a generation of stagnation of wages, sharp concentration of wealth, undermining of benefits, erosion of democracy, which is almost automatic consequence of high concentration of wealth by obvious mechanisms, and has led across the industrial world to bitterness, anger, resentment, often taking pathological forms. It's mislabeled populism, and it has many morbid symptoms, quote Gramsci's phrase in the days of the early rise of fascism. Well, you go back to that article of mine 80 years ago, first words, Austria falls. I was referring to the Anschluss in 1938 when Nazi Germany annexed Austria. But there's a background, as there always is. Go back 10 years, 1920s, Austria had a very lively, vibrant, effective labor movement, a social democratic government. It was crushed by force. There was a huge demonstration in 1928, workers' forces. It was crushed by the army, many people killed. It was basically the end of the Austrian labor movement, and the social democratic forces in Austria, they never recovered. And that led to the rise to the basis for the fascist takeover. It's very striking that the neoliberals in Austria were very supportive of this. Ludwig von Mises, who's the guru of neoliberalism, the great hero, he couldn't control his delight over the crushing of the labor movement for very good reasons. The labor movement and unions were interfering with sound economics. They were distorting market principles by, you can't have an effective market if you have special interests like working people pursuing their own interests. So the crushing of the labor movement by force was quite fine. It was, in fact, preferred by the neoliberals, which tells you something. Tells you that they're very happy to use state violence for their purposes, despite the rhetoric about a small state, if it implements what's called sound economics. Most famous example of that is Chile under Pinochet. We're not only lauded by the neoliberal heroes, but organized and implemented under their influence and control. It's usually forgotten, or rather suppressed, that the neoliberal experiment in Chile, carried out under almost perfect conditions, was a total failure. By 1982, the Friedman and the rest had managed to destroy the Chilean economy. The government had to take it over, took over more of the economy than under Allende. Commentators used to call it the Chicago Road to Socialism, but that's forgotten. That's not part of good history. But use of force is fine, no matter how much you talk about small government. Well, let's go back to the Charter of the Americas in February 1945. That sketched the framework for much of the history of Latin America. There have been repeated efforts to break free of these shackles. Washington has regularly resorted to violence, subversion, by now other techniques, as Marv discussed, to destroy the heresy and restore the rule of Latin American elites who share Washington's conception of good order. Actually, these general tendencies over the past the whole post-war period are very well illustrated in the current scene. So let's start with the most important country in Latin America, Brazil. In 2003, Lula da Silva took office as the candidate of the Workers' Party, the PT. There's an interesting review of his period in office by the World Bank, not a noted radical organization. May 2016, if you want to read it, find it on the internet. The World Bank says that under the Lula period, this was what they call a golden decade in Brazil. I'll quote, "Brazil's socioeconomic progress has been remarkable and internationally noted. From 2003, when Lula took over, the country has become recognized for its success in reducing poverty and inequality and its ability to create jobs. Innovative and effective policies to reduce poverty and ensure the inclusion of previously excluded groups have lifted millions of people out of poverty. Brazil's development path over the past decade has shown that growth with shared prosperity, but balanced with respect to the environment, is possible." And that's the World Bank. The inclusion of previously excluded groups went well beyond poverty reduction. For example, it extended to the opening of educational institutions to previously marginalized groups, other opportunities that had previously been reserved for privileged sectors. Lula also became probably the most respected statesman in the world and a very powerful voice for the global South. Well, that was the golden decade. After the golden decade, after Lula left office, there was a couple of years later, there was a recession that has led to efforts to explain the golden decade in terms of China's rise and the rise of commodity prices. And the recession is attributed to the decline of commodity prices, the slowdown in China, Brazil's major export market. The World Bank disagrees with that. Its analysis says, same analysis, that with the right policies, the government could have continued the development path of the golden decade. But the right policies were blocked by Brazil's powerful predatory financial sector with right-wing support. Those are the first stages of a coup that has been underway to restore good order, sound economics, and the principles of the Charter of the Americas. Lula had been very careful not to infringe on the prerogatives of the Brazilian rich and international investors. But that didn't matter. The achievements could not be tolerated. That was in part because of their nature, but in part because of his origins. Lula's an industrial worker from the poor Northeast region, didn't even speak proper Portuguese, ridiculed by the educated for the way he spoke, the way he looked. Such people should know their place. They're not supposed to become the leaders of the golden decade and the most respected statesmen in the world. That's not their job. The bitter class hatred in Latin America of elites should not be underestimated. Well, after Lula left office, a soft coup began with the impeachment of his successor, Dilma Rousseff, on completely derisory grounds. The final stage, which is a very interesting and instructive one, was last fall. There was to be an election last October. Lula was almost certainly going to win. He was way ahead in the polls. Something had to be done about that. So he was sentenced to jail for 25 years, essentially a life sentence. He's in solitary confinement. not permitted to receive any printed material, very limited visitation rights, and crucially, he's barred from making any public statement, unlike, say, mass murderers on death row. That's important. Actually, my wife Valeria and I were able to visit him in prison last September. His spirits were high, but unless there's significant public pressure, including international pressure, he's going to die in prison if he isn't killed first. Well, the Brazilian prosecutors had solid precedents. When Mussolini's fascist government sentenced Antonio Gramsci to prison in 1926, in a period which has some resemblance to today, as I mentioned, the prosecutor declared that we must stop his brain from working for 20 years. And the Brazilian successors of fascist Italy want to ensure that the most popular political figure in Brazil must be silenced on the eve of an election, and in fact for the rest of his life. There are, of course, official charges. They always are, but if you look at them, they're highly dubious, and they're scarcely detectable by the standards of his accusers. But even if you decide to accept those claims, they are so radically disproportionate to the punishment that Lula was sentenced to silence him right before the election, that he has to be clearly regarded as a political prisoner, in fact, the most important political prisoner in the world. His plight is ignored, which is a very striking testimonial to elite values in the West. There are a few exceptions, rare exceptions. One interesting one is the U.S. labor movement, AFL-CIO, which has just awarded him its main human rights medal. Here's what they said. As a migrant, a worker, a union leader, and a political visionary, Lula da Silva has spent his life fighting for democracy and the rights of workers and excluded communities in Brazil. As president from 2003 through 2010, Lula led millions out of poverty, increased access to higher education and housing for poorer citizens. He became a leader revered worldwide by those who believe a sustainable global economy rests on prosperity being shared broadly. The AFL-CIO therefore honors Luis Inácio Lula da Silva with its annual Human Rights Award. U.S. labor movement is not a radical organization by any means. This incidentally was unreported, which tells us something about the importance of reviving the labor movement that has been smashed by the neoliberal assault, very much like Austria 90 years ago, which was the background for the fascist horrors not long after. The phrase, a leader revered worldwide, is partly correct. It's true in the global south, but not in the centers of world power. Well, with Lula silenced, a vast and well-funded campaign of utterly grotesque lies and vilification poured out on the social media that are the main source of information for much of the population, poor majority certainly. And all that succeeded in bringing to power Jair Bolsonaro, who's actually the worst of the far-right authoritarians who are now plaguing much of the world. His racism, misogyny, homophobia, general vulgarity make Trump look like a civilized gentleman by comparison. What happened in Brazil, I think, is a foretaste of elections that are coming. This is a test test run, worked very effectively. Scott, we can think of the hands that are behind it, but I'll leave that to you. We'll see more of that. So just to illustrate who was elected, typical gesture, Bolsonaro was in the parliament. He voted to impeach Dilma Rousseff, and he dedicated his vote when he voted to her torturer. She was tortured by the military dictatorship. Bolsonaro dedicated his vote to her torturer, who was the leading torturer in the vicious military dictatorship that overthrew a moderate reformist government in 1964 with U.S. Undisguised U.S. support. In fact, the U.S. ambassador, Kennedy Johnson ambassador, called the takeover, the military takeover, the greatest victory for freedom in Latin America mid-century. Typical. Bolsonaro has openly praised the military dictatorship, but he does have some criticisms. He says they weren't violent enough. They should have followed the Argentine model and killed 30,000 people. Going further back, Bolsonaro has criticized the Brazilian cavalry of the 19th century for not adopting the U.S. model and just exterminating the native population. If they'd done that, he says, Brazil wouldn't have its current problems with the indigenous population, which he intends to get rid of, as he said. His chief economist, Paulo Guedes, is an ultra-right Chicago product. His goals, as he says, are to privatize everything. Plans are also to reduce education to elite prerogatives, destroy research, science generally, and in general, just to sell Brazil out to foreign investors. In short, to make it a model of the economic charter of the Americas. This is the most important country of Latin America. Incidentally, ominously for the world, Bolsonaro also intends to open up the Amazon to exploitation by his agribusiness and mining supporters, which has an awful, horrible effect on the environment. This is the lungs of the planet, as they're called. Well, a somewhat similar story has played out in neighboring Venezuela. Hugo Marv talked about the current situation. It's worth looking a little at the background. Hugo Chavez was elected president in 1999, remained in office till 2013. During these years, as in Brazil, poverty was sharply reduced, health standards greatly improved, educational opportunities were extended to broader sectors, the dispossessed were given some voice, some dignity. Elections were held regularly. They were judged by international monitors, including the Carter Center, to have met the highest standards for elections. Popular attitudes were monitored regularly by the respected Chilean polling agency, Latino Barometro. They found that Venezuela ranked in the lead in Latin America, right alongside of Uruguay, in support for the government and support for democracy. Well, like Lula, Chavez was utterly despised by Venezuelan elites, not just for his efforts on the part for the benefit of the lower orders, but like Lula, because of who he was, a person from the working class who actually expressed his pride in his Afro-Indigenous origins, and he actually looked the part. Well, it didn't take long for the Venezuelan elite to act to rid themselves of this offensive creature. In 2002, there was a military coup, deposed the government, disbanded parliament and the courts. It was openly, publicly backed by the United States. It was lauded by the liberal U.S. media. read the New York Times editorial, they're ecstatic about it. It was overthrown within a couple of days by a popular uprising, and then the U.S. turned to subversion, sabotage, aided by the more privileged sectors of the population and the super rich. Well, as in the case of Brazil, there are legitimate charges against the Chavez government, but while they provide fuel for the opposition, they're not the cause of the dedication to overturn the government. That's different. Chavez also made some serious errors. One of them was that he failed to diversify the economy, which retained the neo-colonial structure imposed by the United States a century ago when it kicked Britain out and took Venezuela over. It remained an oil-based economy, which was a serious error. Another error was that during the period of high oil prices, Chavez did not set aside reserves. He spent the income from oil for social programs, for assistance to poor countries in the region, even for assistance to poor people in the United States. But the reserves were not accumulated. That meant that after his death, a couple of years later, when the oil prices declined, there were no reserves to turn to. Venezuela had to turn to international credit markets. Marv already described what happens when you try to do that. They're controlled by a hostile U.S. government. The Maduro government, which came in, continued with serious economic misplanning under Chavez, sometimes severe repression as opposition actions increased. Meanwhile, the extraordinary U.S. sanctions, which are unbelievably harsh, are designed to crush the economy and starve the population into submission. Well, again, as in Brazil, a soft coup is underway. Well, all of this generalizes pretty widely. This is a mere sketch, but omitted a lot of importance. But I think it captures some of the essentials of the turn to the right in Latin America, the reversal of the pink tide, the golden decade, and so on. And it's mirrored in much of the continent, not entirely. Mexico and Uruguay are exceptions. Well, about the future is unpredictable. There are contending forces in all the countries of the region. A great deal depends as well on the international context, particularly on what happens in the United States, and very extensively what happens in Mexico, which along with Brazil is the most important country in Latin America, and Mexican U.S. popular movement solidarity could make a big difference in this case. Thanks.
Bueno, ahora pasamos a un espacio para preguntas y respuestas. Como les dijimos en algún momento, el equipo del Colegio de Sonora recogió algunas de las preguntas escritas que realizaron, buscando integrar las preguntas, ¿no?, lo mejor posible para que fueran contestados como las inquietudes de ustedes. La primera pregunta sería: ¿el cambio de régimen en México constituye un desafío para el gobierno de Trump? ¿De qué manera intentaría enfrentarlo?
I think it's difficult to say that changing regimes almost anywhere at the moment are a challenge for the Trump administration. Part of the reason for that view is that, at least in a certain sense, Trump is extremely inward-looking. His base in the United States is largely focused on his Make America Great Again isolationism. Now, there are people who stand to gain from more global interaction, but Trump's instincts and the instincts of his base are to capture a kind of mythical past that depends upon a vilification of outside others. So what he tends to focus on, and the reason that his base supports him so strenuously, is the scapegoating of people who are not worthy citizens in his view. So what happens in Mexico may or may not affect Trump's rhetoric about the need, for example, for a border wall, which he will continue to maintain as a necessity because his base requires that. We have a very interesting moment in the US. I'm going to deviate from the question just a tiny bit because of the currency of the situation. As you're aware, the long-awaited Muller Report just came out in the last couple of days. And while it doesn't totally vindicate Trump and his administration, it goes far enough that it can be seized upon to undermine virtually any other serious critique of the Trump administration. I think the Democrats have made a serious strategic error in seizing upon what was largely a non-issue to begin with, that is Russian collusion in the American elections, which is dwarfed by gerrymandering, money in politics, voter suppression, and so forth. But what it has done now is to give Trump a kind of megaphone to tout his own victimization by the so-called fake news, which he will trumpet, sorry about that, he will now trumpet endlessly as a way to delegitimize any other critique of the administration. I think they've handed him a tremendous victory here. So at the moment, I think it may be the case that whatever Mexico is interested in doing in terms of international affiliation with the United States, international interaction with the United States, one of the things that I think is going to happen quite soon is that the Democrats will be forced to capitulate on the wall. I think Democrats will be forced, because of this situation, to capitulate on a whole number of fronts, including the extension of very repressive kinds of anti-immigrant, xenophobia, so forth, that Trump now will continue to utilize. So it's very unclear the extent to which Trump will now have to pay much attention to what happens elsewhere in the world. That said, there are certainly elements of US society who have interests that are much more global and much more international than the Trump rhetoric seems to allow. What AMLO will be able to do, what the Mexican government will be able to do, AMLO, I would say, is very pragmatic about the relationship that he has to the U.S. He's said this in public statements about his own goals and so forth. But I think he has to be extremely sensitive to what happens on the north side of the border, much more than Trump has to be sensitive to what happens on the south side of the border.
Just add to that, I agree with what Marv said. It was quite interesting that the Democrats decided to commit suicide on this issue. It was quite obvious at the beginning that nothing's going to come out of the Russian collusion thing. I mean, at most, it might have turned out that Trump had a deal for a Trump hotel in, Red Square or something like that. But nothing serious is going to come out. And there was no possible effect of the Russians in the election, for one reason, because the Senate and the House turned out exactly the same way as the executive, and there wasn't even a claim of Russian collusion there. Furthermore, it was all trivial as compared with the massive interference in the election by private capital, other techniques. So it was all a joke in the first place. The Democrats fell into it because they are unwilling to take on the real policy issues. And the reason is they don't disagree that much with Trump on those matters. Maybe a little, but not much. So instead, they picked on something which turned out to be a total disaster for them and a huge gift to Trump. But it's worth remembering that Trump's rhetoric is directed to only one of his constituencies, the one of secondary importance, namely his voters. He has a much more important constituency, the rich, the very rich, and the corporate sector. Those are the ones he has to serve. And the way it works in American politics is Trump hands over that assignment to the leaders in Congress, Mitch McConnell, Paul Ryan. They design and implement the legislation which just gives lavish gifts to the rich and the corporate sector beyond what avarice could imagine, like the tax cut and deregulation, the whole slew of legislations. Enormous gift to the rich, who happen to be the class enemy of his secondary constituency. Working class people, actually most of his voters, remember, are affluent, but there is a working class sector. And they're the ones who are getting smashed by the commitment to the primary constituency. No, they don't care much about things like the wall. So if Trump wants to rave about, rapists, murderers, Islamic terrorists coming to commit genocide against the white population, the bankers, industrialists can laugh and say, okay, let him have his toys to keep the voters in line. Meanwhile, let him serve us. And he's doing that. American economic power is extraordinary. U.S. corporations U.S.-based corporations now own about 50% of the wealth of the world. If you take a look sector by sector of the global economy, industry, finance, retail, all of them, U.S.-based corporations are either first, or mostly first, sometimes second in every sector. That's an enormous amount of wealth. In fact, that's more control of the wealth of the world than the U.S. had in 1945. There's a tendency now among economists these days and analysts measure the wealth of a country by national accounts. How much is the country's GDP, gross domestic product? That's the wrong measure in an era of globalized international capitalism. The right measure is how much of the wealth of the world is owned by the corporate sector based in the country. And there, the United States is just supreme, strongest it's ever been, getting stronger under Trump and the Republicans. So, okay, as long as he has to keep his voting constituency in line, that's the rhetoric you hear, make America great again. But if you look at the policies, it has absolutely nothing to do with it. I mean, take, say, the revision of NAFTA. It's nothing, It's a few trivial changes, almost meaningless. There have been some analyses of it in the business press, Bloomberg. It has almost no effect. But it can look like a victory. He can say, okay, he can say to the working class, I'm saving your jobs. And meanwhile, they send jobs overseas exactly as they were doing before, and they do it exactly on business grounds. He can yell about it, but they don't care. They're going to try to maximize their profit and control, and Trump is fine with that. They're his primary constituency. So I think you should kind of recognize the rhetoric for what it is. It's an effort to keep his voters in line. He has to throw them some red meat. So a large part of, in fact, probably the most significant part of his voting base is Christian evangelicals. So, okay, he'll throw them opposition to abortion, let's say, or the right of churches to participate in political activity, or a couple of other things like that. Corporate sector doesn't mind. Yeah, they don't care about that. That's the way you keep the voters in line. And it's a problem that actually both political parties have in the United States, the Republicans more than the Democrats. Back in the 1950s, it was C. Wright Mills, a good social political analyst, pointed out the United States is a one-party state. It's the business party. Happens to have two factions called Democrats and Republicans, but it's basically the business party. Now, Republicans a bit more pro-business than the Democrats, but by the 1970s, the Democrats had almost completely abandoned the working class. They handed it over to their class enemy, by now barely represented. So they have really nothing to say when Trump carries out these policies. They can, and in fact, that's one of the reasons, I think, why they fell into the Muller Russiagate trap. But this is beginning to change. There are, the most remarkable thing about the 2016 election, it was not the election of a billionaire with enormous media support and plenty of enormous financial support. It was the Sanders campaign, which broke with a century of American political history, literally. It's the first time a candidate came very close to nomination, maybe winning the election, might well have won if it hadn't been for the machinations of party managers, without any corporate or wealthy support, with no media support, just popular support. Nothing like that has happened for literally well over a century, and it's continuing. There are popular activist forces that are really making significant changes. They haven't changed major policies yet, but people like Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez and others are picking up on popular momentum and activism and doing some serious things. Could make a difference. Maybe the Democrats will decide to commit suicide and undermine these tendencies. And we'll have another Trump presidency. But it's not inevitable. And here again, I think cross-border solidarity is of great significance. There's a lot that Mexicans and people in the US can do together to try to combat these lethal policies. As far as AMLO is concerned, remember what happened with Lula. Lula went out of his way to ensure the rights of the rich and powerful and the financial institutions, but it didn't matter. He was doing things to help the poor. He's the wrong kind of person, got to get rid of him. That's something to think about. Gangster capitalism is savage, and it isn't new. It's taken new forms, but class war goes on bitterly all the time, and if it's one-sided, we're in deep trouble.
Muy bien. Pues es un gusto ver que en el público hay muchos y muchas jóvenes estudiantes, y seguramente de ahí nace la siguiente pregunta. ¿Qué pueden hacer los jóvenes profesionistas para promover la transformación? ¿Desde qué espacios?
Start with almost anything. There's so much work to be done, and one of the huge impediments to getting work done is thinking that nothing can be done. And starting with a small project in coalition with other interested others has unpredictable results. One of the things it thwarts is to lose a battle that's never mounted. Getting one thing done, even if it seems like a very small thing, has the enormous advantage of demonstrating that something can be done. So for young professionals working for social change, social justice, transformation, start with almost anything, something that is of interest and importance in everyday life. The impediment, and there's a second question here that says, can we think about transformation instead of revolution? One of the impediments to thinking about social change is embodied somehow in our usage of the word revolution, which seems to signify everywhere and all at once. That's not necessary, and it's not necessary at all for how social change occurs. Social change occurs when people begin thinking about how to modify the status quo in important ways, move it away from where it is at the moment, create a new imaginary, make clear that it is more possible to think about the end of capitalism than the end of the world. We're facing such enormous material consequences, whether it's endless militarism, whether it is environmental catastrophe, whether it is adverse changes to employment and work in the future. All of these things are manifestations of the failures of the present system. Some of the failures have catastrophic consequences. So anything that can be done is a starting place. And as I say, once something is started, it gives the clear indication that there is no impediment to at least beginning to change. So I would suggest to young professionals, they first of all abandon the notion that change must be everywhere and all at once, and secondly, abandon the idea that nothing can be done.
Just add to that a question to you. What's the difference between what young professionals can do and what auto mechanics can do? What's the difference between them? Well, the answer's pretty straightforward. Young professionals are more privileged. Therefore, they can do more things. The young professionals are lucky. They were able to get some kind of education. They're a little better off. They have more opportunities and more options. So they can do what everyone else can do except more, okay? Because they're more privileged. And a lot can be done. It's really impressive to see what has been done by people with no privilege at all. Children, for example. Take a look at what just happened in the US Congress with the Green New Deal. A crucial idea. Something like the Green New Deal is necessary to save organized human life in the not very distant future. 2 years ago, it was nothing, just ridiculed. A year ago, in fact, there was no such notion. Young kids, the Sunrise Movement, organized, began to pressure for significant environmental action. They sat in on congressional offices. Few people in Congress, like Ocasio-Cortez, picked it up, introduced legislation along with Ed Markey, a senior senator from Massachusetts. Now it's on the mainstream agenda. You can read op-eds in the New York Times making fun of it, but that doesn't matter. It's now strictly right on the agenda. People are thinking about it. Some variant of it may well be introduced. Something like that may literally save organized human life from being destroyed in the near future. Organized by a bunch of kids, young people, okay? What can young professionals do? Plenty more than that, but they have to become engaged.